Hi everyone, welcome to the Green Room. This is a new podcast that Nick and I are going to do. I'm James.
I'm Nick. How you doing?
And every week we're going to come and chat to you for about 25 minutes about something remotely topical and to do with energy saving, to do with the green economy or whatever. And we're going to talk you through various bits and pieces. We last did our video a couple of weeks ago, and we got loads of complaints about the choice of music that I put on it, which was slightly hurtful. But yes. As well as that, the sound quality was terrible. So I apologise if you had to watch that, and hopefully this is marginally better.
But look, since then we had a comment about get some mics and a mixer.
Here we are.
We have a mic and a mixer's behind the camera.
We've got an editor. We've got all sorts. We're going up.
So we take our feedback seriously.
We do, very good.
So thank you very much for that, and keep them coming.
Right, okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to talk about solar again. We talked about it last week, but obviously we had so many comments, constructive feedback, that we thought we'd readdress it and hopefully talk a bit more sense. And then we're going to see how we get on, basically. Mm-hmm. So the question that we're going to answer is it's now almost Christmas. It's December the 14th, I think.
Yes.
December the 14th. And the solar feed-in tariff finishes next spring. And so the question we're going to answer is solar panels, is it worth getting solar panels on your roof now as a sort of domestic customer? So, Nick, solar panels, what are they, what do they do, why would you even get them?
So when you're talking about solar panels in this particular format where they generate electricity, you're talking about PV, photovoltaic. So essentially you'll have panels that are about a metre wide and a metre high, sit on your roof in a combination together, installed to your electricity box, essentially. So when the sun is shining, it is generating electricity. When the sun is not shining, you're not getting any power. So it's what we call an intermittent energy source. Mm-hmm. So, and the performance in terms of that energy source varies in the winter and summer. So in the summer, typically the days are much longer, and therefore we get more light. Mm-hmm. The more light we get, the more electricity that we generate.
Fine. In
the winter, the days are shorter, the less light we get, the less electricity that we generate. So a bit how we talked about the previous video, it's just worth to just quickly dissect the history of how it's worked in the UK. So in about 2010, 2011, not quite sure on the exact dates, but we had fairly generous feed-in tariffs. And the feed-in tariff essentially was a very generous subsidy that's still in existence, that was paid, first of all, to any kilowatt hours of electricity that you generate on your house, so that's your generation. Mm-hmm. And also you get a supplementary export payment for the feed-in tariff. So this is a 50% is what Ofgem and the government assume that you will export back to the grid. So 50%.
So when we're talking about solar PV here, we're talking about grid-tied systems.
Grid-tied systems.
So this isn't someone living in the middle of the woods and they want to put 10 solar panels on their roof.
And it's different to solar thermal, just to say, which is still using solar energy.
But producing hot water.
Hot water, exactly. So very, very generous feed-in tariffs at the beginning, something like 45, 46p. People essentially got it as a an investment, essentially. So actually made a lot of sense because those systems paid back within a few years. You get 12, 16 panels, and actually because of the generosity of it, it made an economic sense to do it. Mm-hmm. But over time, we've had digression. So i.e. the rates have lowered every 3 months. So Ofgem, who are the regulator, they've said, well, because of the price of the panels is going down.
And the price of the panels has gone down a lot. That's worth mentioning.
Yes.
So it was, you'd be paying 15k in 2010, 2011 for a 3.5, 4 kilowatt system, and now you're paying
about $6,500.
Yeah, and actually, I think we're going to go on to it, but since there are fewer solar companies now putting the panels on, which is kind of the result of the feed-in tariff falling, the price of getting it installed has gone up slightly. Mm-hmm. We'll come on to it in a minute, but my sister's got some quotes now, and they were up at, it was £11,000, £12,000 for a quote for a 4 kilowatt system on her roof. Right, and 2 years ago it was 5, 6. So I think there are fewer companies that are charging more, or charge what they can get away with.
And it's also worth saying, so even if you came on to those really generous rates, whatever happens to the feed-in tariff, if they say stopped in April, which we're going to come on to in a second, the rate that you were locked in when you first had the system installed and commissioned is the rate that you will get for that 20-year period from the date that you've had it installed. So don't worry. We had some comments on the YouTube that people worried that if the government get rid of the feed-in tariffs, what will happen to the rates that they've been locked in at? So
and I think that actually initially it was 25 years, right? So when the feed-in tariff was very, very generous at 45p, you were getting that for 25 years. And now it's dropped down to 20 years, and obviously the amounts have come right down. So basically, to recap, I put solar panels on my roof, ideally south-facing, to capture as much sunlight as possible.
Between southwest and southeast?
Yeah. And then, so I'm producing electricity. For every unit of electricity I produce, I get paid something called the generation tariff. For that, and that's metered, so they actually put a meter on and they record that. And then I also get paid at the export tariff, and that is exactly 50% of what I generate, because they take your generation reading and they halve it. So you get paid that payment. And then obviously you get the free electricity as well.
And it's a grid-tied system.
Grid-tied system. Yeah. So the payments now. So if you were to get solar panels installed on your roof today, have you got the numbers?
I think you're the numbers man. Let's.
Looking sideways here in my notes. So you've got. So you get paid 3.86 pence to generate 1 unit of electricity, right? So that is a massive reduction on the sort of
40p's. Yeah.
And that is provided that your energy performance certificate, so on the day that you get the system commissioned, the EPC rating on your house has to be D or better to get that. So if you have a very inefficient house, so 1920s house, no insulation, no loft insulation, rubbish heating system, and you get solar panels installed, potentially you're not even going to get that generation tariff. So the lower generation rate is 0.2, so 0.2 pence per kilowatt hour, which, to be honest, you're not really getting anything.
It's essentially like you've got nothing there.
So you have to, number one, if you're going to do solar, you have to get your EPC rating up to band D or better before you even consider it. And I think it used to be the case, and we may get comments on this, but it used to be the case that the solar PV you could install and that you could then get the EPC, and if it took it over the D, you'd then benefit, whereas they've stopped that.
Because it has a underlying SAP score, so all the domestic EPCs, they're rated between 1 and 100. 100 is very good, 1 is very bad. We'll talk about EPCs in a second, but essentially band D would be early 60s to early 70s type rating.
Yes.
So
okay, so that's what I generate, and then on my export I get 5.24 pence, I think, which is it's gone up slightly over time, and these numbers, all the payments you're getting and whatever rate you lock in at, they will then go up with inflation. It's
And where are we going to get to in April 19?
So April 19, they're planning on cancelling it completely. So there will be no feed-in.
But you will still be protected. The important thing is for people who have.
Yeah, if you've already had the solar panels installed and you've been commissioned and you're receiving a feed-in tariff, before that date you will receive that feed-in tariff for however long it lasts. So it's 25 years or 20 years depending on when you signed up for it. So the payments are obviously still going to come in. Now, that being said, not everyone cares about the feed-in tariff. So they will get solar panels for different reasons. Obviously, if someone's going to give you money, you'd be foolish to say no. But people are getting solar panels because they're heating their homes with electricity, which actually, if you look at the price of electricity compared to the price of gas, electric heating is about 4 times the price. So if I'm producing free electricity, there's benefits there.
Yeah, and listen, the more volatile our supply of fuels is, for instance, and currency movements, and also just the general trends in terms of where electricity prices are going, it is, as you were just alluding to, it's a great way to protect yourself in the long run, as one of the reasons why it's still kind of making sense. But what I would say is, it probably doesn't make sense to do as a standalone measure. A measure, what I mean is, having just that one thing physically installed, because you can't just walk up onto the roof and just fasten them. You do need someone professional that will put up scaffolding and have good access, and then you need a fairly stable roof to do it. So I'm thinking more that if people are out there looking to make bigger improvements onto their property, so say they're looking to do a side extension, back extension,
that's time to do it. Replacing
loft, roof replacement, because you're going to do those things anyway. You can kind of spread those costs onto a bigger project. And
I'd say that when you get solar installed, if you have one solar panel or 40 solar panels, you still need all the, I'm going to use the word, the rubbish that goes with it. So inverters and all the cabling and that sort of thing.
The accessories.
Exactly. I was going to use the word gubbins, but so you still need that. So actually, the solar panel itself isn't that expensive. So if you have a big roof space, you may as well go to town if you're going to get solar, because your returns will be better. The more solar panels you get, you still need the inverter. The inverter is a big part of the cost. But I think that the solar industry now is changing because of the introduction of battery technology.
So Tesla Powerwall will set you back about £6,000 just for the unit,
and then a couple of grand to install it. So it's a lot of money. But basically, what you're doing here is you're producing electricity during the day. Now, if you're out during the day, so you've got jobs or whatever you're doing, you can't use that electricity. You can store the electricity you're producing and then use it during the evening to watch telly or have the lights on or cook or whatever you need to do. And I think more and more people are doing that because it sort of protects them against, as you say, changes in electricity prices.
Yes, and we don't. I mean, domestic dwellings in terms of energy consumption, unless you work from home or you're at home for the majority of the day. Normally, by 9 o'clock you're in the workplace, and after 5:30 you're back.
Sometimes at 9, sometimes marginally later.
Yeah, marginally later. But there's peaks and troughs in terms of when you use it in a domestic environment. So what you really want is from this storage system, because what I talked about, the intermittency of the power source, you need that then storage to be used at the times when you really need it. So when you come in the evening and you make your tea, you're going to be using various appliances, so like ovens, kettles, tea.
But it's an expensive thing. I think what we haven't mentioned is 6.5k, big outlay, £6,000, £8,000 with install, expensive. There are cheaper batteries, but there are things like solar diverters.
Yes.
So like the Apollo Gen.
Yes.
And so how this works is, basically I've generated all the electricity. I'm being paid as if I'm exporting 50%. So if I export 100% of my electricity or 0% of my electricity back to the grid, I still get 50% payment, right?
Yes.
What the solar optimizers do is they basically, whenever your house is producing an excess of electricity, instead of sending it back to the grid, it will send it to something like your immersion. Yeah, so you're being paid as if you're exporting 50%, but it's trying to minimise what you're exporting, so you can reap the benefits of the free electricity. So these are about £250.
Yes.
And I remember on my brother's old house, they had solar panels, and they, from between April and October, they just didn't have to have heating on at all, because they didn't need any, they didn't need to produce the hot water, because this optimizer was producing all of that hot water.
So optimizer is essentially it's a box that sits between the system and your consumer unit, essentially, and the storage. And
it's reading what you're producing from your solar panels and what your house is using in terms of electricity. And as soon as there is an excess, normally that would be sent back to the grid. But this little gadget basically pings it to your immersion. You can put it into storage heaters. You can do all sorts of quite clever things with it.
Slightly cheating in the sense that you'd assume that whatever the excess is would go back into the grid, but actually
so you're not giving back.
Yes.
Yeah. So
but you're still getting the 50%.
You're still getting 50%. So it's a way to use the electricity. It's
fairly legitimate.
It's a legitimate way. I mean, we get lots of comments on it because people sort of think you're cheating the system because you've got a grid-tied system, and therefore you should be putting the electricity back into the grid to help the grid survive. We've got power stations closing down left, right, centre. We've got 20% of our power comes from nuclear, and they're all due to close in the next 5-6 years. So we will see a step change reduction in our electricity production. So if people are producing their own electricity and they feed it back into the grid, in theory that helps. But I know that, actually the grid isn't flexible enough to accept electricity from all these little producers. If there's 28 million homes in the
it's a
UK,
Victorian system. It's archaic and it's not quite
ready to have 27 million micro people sending electricity back to the grid and stuff.
But I'll tell you what, that's what is important what you said there. I mean, that's what got me involved in this industry is the fact that I can see, and although it is archaic and it's still very Victorian in its design and its makeup and its delivery, it is slowly changing, and the investments are taking place and they will take place over the next 10, 15, 20 years to make it a lot more demand driven, a lot more local driven, because
I think it has to be, because at the moment we have to be ready to hit peak demand, which is kind of sensible. If everyone turns on their kettle at half-time of the World Cup final, then we have to be ready to meet that electricity demand. However, if there are ways that we could get businesses to use electricity at different times, running machinery at different times, encourage them to do that, which there's off-peak management, then there are ways to minimise that peak demand, which are obviously going to come into play. But obviously, it needs to be able to take in, instead of having 4 or 5 big nuclear power stations delivering all of our electricity, the losses upon the grid are massive from that kind of delivery mechanism. So if we have lots of little power plants, so decentralise it, then it is going to work better, isn't it?
Yeah. Just going back, just to finish on solar. So what would you, based on what you've just said, in terms of, so if I was a homeowner now, in 2018 going to 19, what would you do?
So
in terms of solar PV?
Number one, I get lots of quotes. Right, I think there are companies out there who are definitely going to try and take a decent payment for getting solar panels installed, probably more than they should be. And that, as basically as the Feed-in Tariff has dropped, a lot of the smaller companies have dropped out of the market. So there aren't as many solar PV companies out there, so they are charging more. So that's number one, so get loads and loads of quotes. If you're going to get a small system, so anything beneath 3 kilowatt, me personally, I wouldn't bother. Right, I just don't think you're producing enough electricity to do that. I mean, if a house uses on average about 4,500 kilowatt hours a year, and I have 3.5 kilowatt solar PV system, I'm looking at sort of 2,900, 3,000 kilowatt hours I produce. So in theory, if I could use all that, I'm producing about 2/3 of my electricity. If you're going to put a 1.5 kilowatt system on your roof now, the feed-in tariff doesn't make it worthwhile.
Yeah.
So I probably wouldn't go that way. If I was off grid, or not, when I say off grid, I mean off the gas grid more than anything. So I have to use either electricity to heat my home or oil or something like that. I would be I would look at solar PV as a solution. Just because the cost of electricity it's 4 times the cost.
It's also important to say. So, if say if you're in the city where you've got a mixture of low and high rises, shading is a big part as well. So although you might be south facing, the fact that if there's a building there in front of
the chimney goes over or whatever, it can really hamper the amount you produce.
Yes.
The solar, just on that point, so the solar panels, if I have 10 solar panels in my solar array, if you have one standard inverter, so one inverter on the whole lot, if there's a chimney and it casts shading on one of the panels, all of those panels will operate at the rate of the worst performing panel. All right, so if one panel is operating at 50% production, all of the other panels will operate at that level. There are ways to get around it. So something like a microinverter.
Yes.
So basically, each solar panel has its own mini inverter. Expensive to get. If you're looking at a sort of a big inverter, you're looking at like £1,200 to buy a proper inverter. Microinverter.
We had a lot of questions on this, so there was a lot of people around you, myself, Harry as well, asking. There's companies going around and quoting, how much the microinverters were, and they were just charging.
They're charging a lot. They are charging a lot. I think.
So would you wait until the old inverter goes?
So wait until the old inverter goes, because that will obviously always be installed with your system. If your system is guaranteed, they normally say the guarantee is about 25 years for the system, but the inverter will tend to be half of that. So they'll say 10 to 12 years. You need to look at that, and basically because the voltages going through those big inverters are so high, they don't last that long. The microinverters, they will last 25 years. So, tricky one. I mean, you've kind of got to weigh it up, and you've got to get 12 years in, you've got to decide, do I get another inverter, or do I get a microinverter on the panels, get 2 quotes. It's tricky to weigh it up, just on you, but you need to look at the numbers and see what works best. Obviously, it helps if you've got 25 years and you're getting 45p per kilowatt you produce, i.e. the feed-in tariff from 2011, because you're being paid potentially £1,000 a year to produce electricity, so suddenly actually spending that becomes a bit easier.
So it's just worth mentioning in this studio, maybe next week we might get the voice. So that would be Harry, who's our producer, but she is communicating with us, so just keeping us on topic and stuff. She did just mention what is worth saying, that the feed-in tariff is not only exclusive to solar panels. So, for instance,
you've got micro, hydro, all sorts of things.
CHP boilers.
Yeah.
So that sort of stuff. So it's not limited to just solar PV. So I think.
And I would look at the rates. So the rates do vary for the different technologies, right? So you've just got to have a look at that. If you've got questions on feed-in tariffs, then obviously you can come back to us.
But listen, just give us the feedback on the on what we've discussed on solar in the comments below. But we're kind of pressed for time. So
we're definitely on solar PV. It's not the end of it. I mean, we'll talk about batteries in a whole load more detail because that's becoming a big thing. But I think you're about to go on. We've got to move on.
To energy performance certificates, which is a
so
little bit dry.
Right, the EPCs are really dry. Okay, so they are basically, every property in the UK, commercial, domestic, has an energy performance certificate. They last...
If it's been commissioned. So if someone's asked you to go out and actually produce one.
If you're renting one or whatever, if you've got to sell a house, it needs an EPC.
But it's quite likely that since they came in 2007, 2008, that a transaction would have taken place on that property, and therefore it should have one.
Sale, so it should have one. An EPC is valid for 10 years. Let's do domestics, I guess, because that's the one that most people have them.
So as I said, that it gives you a little bit like your cars, your consumer, your white goods, like your refrigerators, etc. They have a little sticker, with A, B, C, D, F, G in terms of tells you the efficiency of it. Properties have the same thing. So on the domestic, one is extremely bad, which is a G, right at the bottom, so very inefficient property. And A is extremely efficient, so i.e.
And almost impossible to get.
Almost impossible, yeah. You have to spend a lot of... So you get the cost benefit, so it's passive house standard, air tightness, it's probably got microgeneration.
You would never retrofit to an A. Yeah.
You wouldn't unless...
You build to an A.
Yes.
That makes sense.
Unless, well, I mean, there might be some folks out there who want to kind of undertake the projects, and the cost and the investment is not an issue, and they want to live in that type of property, but to get it to that point, it would be an extraordinary amount of work to do on that, and it would completely change so effectively it becomes a bit like a new build in its final format. So
how much does an EPC cost?
It varies. For instance, normally they are depending upon the size of the property. So like a flat, it might be say between £55 to £70, and anything bigger, probably 70 to about £100. So it just depends on the region of the country you're at. But essentially involves an assessor going around to the property, spending about half an hour to 45 minutes, taking various measurements within that property, looking at all the energy emitting devices, so like boilers, the fabric, for instance. So the fabric has a big input. So, how much energy can escape? Is that fabric got insulation? So insulation obviously helps. Bad windows don't help. Good windows help. So things like that, they will look at those things. But they can only go with what they see in the property. Sometimes we get comments like, "Why is my energy? I've I don't know, replaced my 1990s double glazing with, 2010 double glazing. Why is the rating only gone up by 1 point?"
Yeah.
And it's important to say that the standards or the methodology of how the EPCs have been calculated is a little bit of a simplistic methodology, but also if you think about it, windows in terms of the absolute area of a property
compared to the wall, for example,
are a smaller bit of that.
So I think we're going to go. So future one, we're going to talk about what top 10 ways to improve the efficiency of your house in the most costly way. So we won't go into that in too much detail now.
Do you want to talk about commercial or?
Well, just going back to EPCs, if you require one when you're selling or renting a property, I would advise not to go via your estate agents or your lawyers to get one. I would go directly to an EPC company. The reason is you will pay a fraction of the price, so that's definitely worth doing.
Mm-hmm.
You will see massive differences between the same EPC done by two different people. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So, and the reason is because, as Nick said, measurements number one, but also the time and care. So I think this whole industry, people see it very much as a tick box exercise. You need an EPC to rent the property. They will therefore pay as little as they can to get one done.
Look, I think it's important. I think it's important genuinely to get the best possible value.
Well, it is now because of this MEES thing.
Yes.
So do you want to explain briefly about that?
So I was just going to just add to what you said about if you, so for instance, so what I said there about the assessor only being able to put in the software what they see because it's a non-intrusive inspection, so they won't go around and
so they can't lift up the loft boards and
or floorboards. If you've had floor installations, for instance, or if you've had, say, internal insulation, they can't see that through the plastering. So if you have documentation in place, the time of when it was improved, and if it was signed off by the installation company, and it tells you, say for instance, for internal insulation, how thick it is, what materials have been used, then all that can go into the software, and that will give you credit towards that EPC.
It'll definitely boost your rating.
Yes.
So what you want to do is be as complete as possible and as honest as possible with your installer, provide all the information they ask for.
So don't be annoyed by the assessor if they miss something out because of these legitimate reasons, because they haven't seen it, or you weren't at the property to take them round to point things out. So as you said there, so it depends on the assessor, depends on the measurements, but also there's certain things you can do as the person requesting the EPC to make sure the assessor is made aware of some of these good bits that will obviously add up to the value.
Yeah. And commercial EPCs a bit more complicated.
It's more to do with the type of business, the property type, and how much energy is used for the use of that property. So, for instance, if it's an office, it will probably use majority of that on heating and lighting. But then, say a warehouse or a workshop will have complex machinery and it'll be more ventilated, so all those things like airflow, it's just a lot more complicated.
And software's more complicated.
It's convoluted as well, very convoluted.
It's more
software.
expensive to lodge a commercial EPC than a residential EPC, so you're going to be paying considerably more, right, to get these done. And it tends to depend on the complexity of the building, as you say. So if it's a big warehouse, despite it, it might be a 20,000 square foot warehouse, relatively easy to do if it's just one big space. Whereas if it's an office block or a hotel or something like that, it takes a bit longer. In terms of
both, as you've said, they are massively key. So since April this year, the minimum energy efficiency standards came into force for the private rental sector. So essentially,
for both commercial and domestic.
For commercial and domestic. So from April, if I wanted to say move into a warehouse as a business, or I wanted to rent out a flat. That rating on that EPC has to have been better than rating E on both commercial and domestic. So where that had failed, obviously the lawyers and the transaction had been held back on that basis. So it goes back to the landlord to then do something about it. So and obviously that's a massive topic in itself, because you've got exemptions, you've got who pays for those improvements?
So
why should they tend to pay for it?
One
for the future. But as you can see, it is moving in a direction where we need to, at a countrywide level, a global level, we're committed to reduce the CO2 emissions.
And I think that, in America, they're all the properties are made out of wood, essentially. They're timber frame properties. They're really easy to make. Here we have...
Unless you're in the East Coast and you're one of the...
Fine. But we tend to have older proproperties here.
Yeah.
Right? So then we have a real issue that we have loads of old properties. Our housing stock is very inefficient. Sorry. And so I think the EPCs... I think the government will find a way to make them more relevant rather than this tick box exercise, and I think they might in time tie them to council tax.
So it's just important to say that there has been a consultation that the government have actually commissioned on energy performance certificates. So it's one that we fed back to a few months ago. So there was certain changes that we'd like to see take place. So obviously, if you're watching this video after March the 31st, i.e. the Brexit date,
yeah,
things could be
we want to be here.
A lot different. But it's just to say, at the time of us recording now, which is December 2018, because this Brexit has taken a lot of government time, it's meant that certain things like
they're taking the back seat,
the energy sector and have not had that much priority, and therefore there's not been that much committee time space taken towards it, and therefore everything's kind of gone on to that one issue. But it could be in a different place in 2019, but there's definitely willingness on the government's part, certainly from the meetings I've been to, that are looking into EPCs, how to make them more sort of relevant.
I think the one thing that we get asked quite a lot on the EPCs, so if you do, and this is commercial domestic, same thing, if you do loads of work to your property, so I'm just going to say this because I just remembered it, but if you do lots of work on your property, you don't need to get a new EPC, right? I think that's worth mentioning. So your EPC is valid from 10 years from the commission date. So you can go to, if you Google the EPC register, you can put your postcode in, you can see if there's an EPC.
Unless you're doing what we talked about before, you're putting solar panels on and you want the feed-in tariff.
And you want a higher feed-in tariff. But even if I put an extension on the back of my house, I don't need a new EPC. If I have a valid one, it's valid for 10 years. It doesn't matter what I do to the property, that existing EPC will still be valid. The rating will obviously be different.
It's not very good though, is it? So you can do
all
these...
No, it's not. But I mean, it's if it's 60 quid that you can save, we're trying to save people money. You don't need to get that EPC until the 10 years is up, or I can sell a house with an EPC that is 8 years old, having done lots of work 8 years into the process.
And I think that they were, so they were in their design more for the private rental sector, because that's the one that sees the transactions. If I own my own property, I'm likely to make improvements to it over time anyway.
Yes.
So therefore, by the nature of it, it's becoming more efficient anyway, and therefore it's using less carbon. So the bit that the government can kind of tackle easier through regulation is the private rental sector.
And I think that is also the sector where people historically, so the tenants in those properties, have had the really bad experiences, because they're renting a place and the landlord doesn't care about it.
Interesting. Harry just mentions that in Wales your mortgage rates are now dependent upon the EPC, or the EPC rating has an impact.
Oh, there we go. Interesting.
So it's interesting. We'll see whether that happens in England or Scotland. So we need to look into that. So if anyone knows, if they've had these discussions in Wales and how it's impacted, feel free to comment, because that's
cool.
It's a good thing, yeah.
So hopefully, guys. So this is. I think we're coming to an end now. I think this is our first proper try at this.
Bit raw.
And so we got some really good constructive feedback. I don't want to say criticism last time. So in the same way, guys, we'd love to get your thoughts. As I say, this is the green room. This is our first podcast. So
if you'd like to see guests, or if that's
or you want us to talk about something in particular.
Yeah.
If you've got questions, far away. We will endeavour to answer them. I'm not going to say we're always correct, but hopefully most of the information is pretty accurate.
Just to say for housekeeping, so the video will be available on YouTube, also podcast.
Yeah, we're going to try it
as an audio, hopefully, and also the link will be on the YouTube channel, but also on the Green Age website as the sidebar. So the latest videos and
Yes.
Podcasts are on the top right or on the front page.
And what we're going to start, so this is our first attempt sort of prior to Christmas, and then I think we're going to see how this one goes, and then we will then endeavour to do this weekly from the new year. So hopefully, you know.
And hopefully in the next one, just feed in a bit more weekly energy news. So we do a publication, or Harry does a publication on the weekly news in terms of what's happened. Yeah. So. Let's hopefully.
And hopefully we'll be a bit more relaxed next time. We'll have done one. We'll have, you know.
I blame the lack of cup of tea.
I know. Yeah.
Have a beer.
Exactly. It's Christmas.
So guys, listen. Thank you for persevering and listening to us ramble on. Have a fantastic Christmas, and we will catch you in 2019.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
All the best.